protagonist, after being dealt a horrific loss of someone close in their life, must come face to face with an evil cult. In order to survive, they must come to terms with their trauma while their entire world collapses around them. Eventually, they find solace and accept the loss as their stories end with a cathartic and literal fire. So today, we're talking about MIDSOMMAR, film Twitter's beloved darling of a horror film, and Ari Aster's self-described The Wizard of Oz for perverts. And we're also talking about Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan's sequel to The Shining, because there is nothing that would improve The Shining more than
General Kenobi
and a very, very ridiculously hot spirit cannibal, Stevie Nicks. Now, these two films have a lot more in common than you think. One's a mainstream cult classic, while the other one is a direct sequel to a cult classic starring a classic cult, dealing in the occult. Classic. I'm starting to realize that both of these films have much more in common than at first glance. Crappy cult jokes aside, I want to take the time to address, compare, and contrast how both of these films deal with their common themes: the cycle of life and death and the processing of trauma. Now, it's pretty obvious that horror as a genre has treaded familiar ground like cults and murder and the trauma caused by that phenomena in the past. But the interesting thing behind these films in regards to both MIDSOMMAR and Dr. Sleep is how these films both not only include them, but they diverge in their treatment to tell their stories. So before we get into it, just a heads up, this video will spoil both MIDSOMMAR and Dr. Sleep. Be sure to come back and check out the video after you've seen both the films. Alright, here we go. Part 1. Danny and Danny. MIDSOMMAR's plot is launched into action when Danny, played by the ever-fantastic Florence Pugh, discovers her immediate family had died in a grisly murder-suicide at the hands of her sister. It doesn't do her any good that she finds little to no comfort from her already tenuous relationship with her boyfriend Christian and his friends. Danny is looking for an escape from her trauma. She thinks that going to Sweden will provide something for that need, but the tensions of her already falling apart relationship and the initial consumption of psychedelics makes it more and more difficult. It isn't until she half-reluctantly falls in with the Harga, who, despite their archaic and, in today's terms, barbaric cultural practices, she finds a community who emotionally and physically empathize with her pain. Dr. Sleep, being this direct sequel to The Shining, focuses on a grown-up Danny Torrance, played by Rodney Copperbottom, who, much like Danny, is deeply traumatized by his experiences with his late father, his abilities, and the ghosts of the Overlook Hotel. Now, unlike other Danny, Dan Torrance at the start of the story is literally taught to lock away his ghosts and demons in mental boxes, sealing them away in a representation of the Overlook's hedge maze in his brain. He drowns out The Shining and his memories with drugs, sex, and alcohol until he moves to a small town where he sobers up and gets a steady job at a hospice, using The Shining to comfort old folks before they pass away. Dan went about escaping his trauma in ways that were harmful to himself and others, and his story is spent atoning for it. He finds this atonement in his relationship with Abra, a young girl who also possesses The Shining, and in protecting her from the cult known as the True Knot, he confronts his experiences at the Overlook Hotel, his memories of his murderous father, and uses the literal ghosts that have haunted him his entire life to save someone else's. The arcs of these characters, in a way, mirror each other, in the way that they both face their shared challenge and then split directly opposite of each other in the final acts of their respective films. Danny Arter, when presented the choice, abandons or kind of just lets the Harga murder the isolated every man for himself world that she came from, in favor of a society who has done nothing but treat her respectfully and with empathy for her situation. She offers Christian as the final sacrifice, a choice that allows her to live on, a happier and a valued member of her new collective society, and for the Harga to have their plentiful harvest and to go on with their life cycle. Danny Torrance spent years of his life trying to keep the ghosts quiet, and it wasn't until he finally listened to the very one protecting and guiding him, Dick Halloran,
You still owe a debt, son. Pay it.
that he would become Abra's protector and teacher as well. And when faced with the cult, who sought a live sacrifice to prolong their own lives, he played them at their own game. And when he and Abra were all out of tricks, he guided their leader to the Overlook Hotel for a final confrontation with her, his own father, and the very ghosts that he spent a lifetime trying to keep locked up. That isn't to say that the ghosts of the Overlook Hotel didn't also nearly consume Dan Torrance like they did his father. It's only with Abra's influence that Dan Torrance briefly overcomes his possession and blows up the Overlook, thus silencing the malevolent spirits of the hotel forever. Consumed by the flames, Dan Torrance reunites with the spirit of his dead mother. The last time we see him is as a spirit himself, he too being Abra's guide and teaching her to lock away the evils that haunt the living. For Danny Arter, trauma is dealt with by violently and severing the ties to one's past, the ones who fail to listen to you or care for your problems for the good of the collective, and whatever else remains will be used to ensure the collective's longevity. In this case, the people you came with get murdered to fertilize the crops, and your boyfriend gets used as a sperm bank. Danny Torrance faced his past as nobly as he did harmfully. He might have done much to quiet the ghosts of his past, but it was when he listened to the ones that helped him along the way that allowed him and allowed Abra to survive. Trauma for Danny Torrance are just teachings in growth disguised as demons. One can coexist with them, but if others like him are to survive, one must pass on their lessons to those who come after us, whether it be in this life or beyond. Part 2. The Harga and the True Knot. I do love evil cults. They're a staple of a genre, and you can use them as a device to say a lot about society as a whole. Both Midsommar's The Harga and the Dr. Sleep's True Knot are no exceptions to this. The True Knot plays more to the evil portion of the evil cult. We literally see them murder a child in their first scene. Talk about establishing a threat level. But what I find really cool about how they and their leader, Cannibal Hat Goth GF, is their position as foils to Danny Torrance. Dan is a loner who keeps his shine to himself, sees little value in his living relationships outside of Bill. The True Knot celebrate their respective shines. They look out for each other and they mourn those that they lose. And if it weren't for the whole child murdering thing, they would just be a band of wandering hippies. But that's the thing, the ritualized child murder. The facet that the members of the True Knot all have in common, and the one that they value the most above all, is the consumption of shine, or steam, to prolong their own lives. A fear of death balances out their love for each other, and they're more than willing to make human sacrifices to keep it being death, at bay. This fear comes out in the form of an insatiable hunger. That's not to say just because they're hungry and scared doesn't excuse them from their actions. Rose the Hat and the rest of her posse know what they're doing, and they're doing bad shit. And there were times in the movie I felt like they were really hamming it up. It makes sense. The movie implies that the True Knot have been at this for decades or even centuries. Acting like this is some sort of uncontrollable urge doesn't really do them any services. They're nigh immortals that torture and eat kids. The toll of time never really gave them the chance to feel any remorse about it, and thus they never have. Now, comparisons to the Harga don't just stop at the weird breath shit. It was a rather intense debate between me and my friends when we first saw MIDSOMMAR whether the Harga even fit the definition of a cult. Sure, you've got the matching clothing and the human sacrifice and the ritual stuff, but there's no central charismatic leader the Harga society revolves around. The May Queen is a festivity-related individual and not the head of all of Harga society. So maybe the Harga aren't necessarily a cult, or evil for that matter. They're the antagonists of the film, yeah, but looking at this from an anthropological angle, the consensual elder suicide, the incest, the psychedelics, the rape, that's pretty fucking evil. I do feel like shit for having to laugh at that scene. Does anyone else here agree with me? Because moving on. The human sacrifices and all that, they're all just part of their culture. The Harga themselves treat all of those rather pragmatically. It's why it's implied their society has survived for this long. It's here when the Harga's values aligned with the True Knots. They very much care for their own. Everyone has their place in the group, and sometimes to ensure survival, rituals need to be performed and sacrifices have to be made. But the Harga succeeded where the True Knot failed, and I'm not talking about how they quote-unquote won the movie. Part 3. Life and Death. This is a theme repeated in both films. In MIDSOMMAR, Harga society revolves around the life cycle of an individual and the various rites of passage between each stage of life, all culminating in a sacrifice to create and help along other lives. In Dr. Sleep, the main characters and their shine are defined by the relationship to the dying, the dead, and the spirits of the dead. Some, like Danny, use their shine to help along dying people pass peacefully. Others, like the True Knot, feed off the shine of others to prolong their mortal coils. Now, it was because of this relationship that doomed the True Knot to fail. The group's guiding notion of causing and feeding off of the pain of others in order to prolong their own lives made them manipulative and greedy in their practices, thus making them fall victim to their own tricks upon coming into conflict with Dan, Torrance, and Abra. The narrative even reflects this with Rose the Hat's fate, as she is consumed by the ghosts of the Overlook Hotel in the same fashion. The Harga are much more in tune with the whole life and death thing, and they're placed in that very cycle. Their rituals, whether it be the pube in the pie or the incest coloring book of lore, is all about the creation and guiding of life and the living, or the consensual passing into death to return resources to the land and paying homage to the forces that be that allow life to exist. The Harga, as demonstrated by Pele, have no qualms about he, himself, or his parents kicking the bucket. There is no trauma or pain about dying or those who have died in Harga society. In both films, life goes on after the credits roll. In Dr. Sleep, some spirits pass quietly, some haunt us. But there's something after you die, and sometimes that something, or someone, will guide us to better pastures. In Midsommar, it's only in the acceptance of death, of those who refuse to care for her, did Danny, like Pele, and many Harga before, accept the deaths of her immediate family. Part 4. Processing Trauma. Experiencing a death is a traumatic experience. Processing the shockwaves after it happens is oftentimes what defines us as human beings. Sometimes we blame ourselves, and we let those spirits linger on because of the things we think we did. We'll do anything to shut them up and shut them out. Sometimes we'll take it out on other people. Sometimes we'll shut ourselves away from the people who care about us. And other times, people who think they know what's going on with us will use our trauma as an excuse to get what they want, not even taking you or your feelings into consideration. To lose people is a harrowing experience, and you can go about dealing with it in 2 ways. The MIDSOMMAR way. You find a group, or a group finds you, who helps lighten the load. And with the power of collective empathy and a little bit of ritual, they take on your burden, and you all care for each other as a unit. Or the Dr. Sleep way. You take the teachings of the past that have helped you up until this point, confront the ghosts that have hurt you, and have the potential to hurt others, and lock them away until you can use them to grow. Teach those that come after to do the same. Now, I can very easily come to the conclusion that the Dr. Sleep methodology here is the better, more morally upright standing one, because, the lines are much more drawn black and white in that film. But if we're going to extrapolate just how both films treat processing trauma, I want to say both approaches are valid here. A group who understands your struggle and all feel your pain helps you feel less lonely and isolated when you're dealing with it. Sometimes rituals help with that. And I'm not talking about, sewing your ex into a bear suit and lighting his ass on fire. No, I'm talking about journaling or taking up a new hobby. Those are all rituals in themselves. It's the regularity and importance we put into those activities that make them rituals. Cutting out toxic people in your life is just as important. Just, don't send your therapy group to murder them for the sake of growing crops. For all we know, every Christian is a Danny Torrance who's reeling in from their own bullshit, going about their lives like an asshole, because that's all their dad and their weird hotel experience at 5 years old ever taught them to do. But having the ability to lock away your ghosts and demons means also having the ability to learn from them and to grow from them, and if necessary, to let them loose, if it means protecting someone you care about. At the end of the day, death is as inevitable as life. But with both of these films, it's how we go about everything else afterwards that truly matters. Closing thoughts. The thing that blew my mind when I first thought about making this video essay was the fact that both of these films ended with something on fire. But it's more than just buildings on fire. It was the last remnants of both the protagonists' past and subsequently their past trauma going up in smoke for similar reasons. The Atastupa contained the last of Danny Arter's connection to an uncaring world. The Overlook Hotel had all the ghosts that destroyed the lives of the Torrance family. The Harga burned Danny Arter's demons so that they can have children and raise crops. It just so happened that Danny was better for it. The Shining and the ghosts that guided Danny Torrance led him to burn down the Overlook Hotel and subsequently his demons so others, like Abra, could live. Now, the immediate fears presented by these films were much more focused on whether the protagonist, and subsequently us as the audience, would be consumed by the machinations of these hungry cults. Survival from these moments of terror are ultimately defined by those who we surround ourselves with, and how we are supported by them when we face the traumas of the past and present. We can face those traumas and ultimately face fate with grace in order to protect the ones that we care about. Or we can face death with a smile on our face, melded into a group who may or may not have manipulated us into their violent and hungry ways. And in my opinion, that's a fate much more terrifying than death itself. Thanks for watching.